there's a business model that they kind of lead you towards as a writer. And it was, do your degree, get your PhD, submit your PhD novel to a major national award, win it, and then go teach in universities for the rest of your life. And that was like, it wasn't a great model of being a writer, but it was the only model that I really felt like I had access to. So Clarion was really transformative because it was a point where professional writers and editors said, no, here's what you're going to do if you want to get published. You're going to do this and this and this. You're going to submit here and here and here. And you know, it was the first time someone sort of sat me down and sort of said, here's what you need to understand about writing. It's a bulk industry. Like, you don't write your one great short story and send it off, and that's going to make your career. Write 20, send them off, and then write the next 20. And as soon as someone told me that, I was like, oh, that all makes perfect sense.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 313 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Peter M. Ball. Now, Peter is an author, a publisher, RPG gamer, who has been engaged in indie publishing ventures since well before most of the cool kids started doing it. He's the author of the Miriam Astor series and the Keith Murphy urban fantasy thrillers, numerous story collections, and more articles, poems, and RPG material than he'd care to count. He's one half of Brain Jar Press with his partner Sarah, and loves experimenting and pushing the boundaries of indie and digital publishing. And we talk about all that and more coming up later in this episode. First, let's hear a word about this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. If you are looking to get an audiobook produced and distributed out in the market, look no further than Findaway Voices. If you're looking for a professional narrator, Findaway Voices has a marketplace where you can find a professional narrator. Lots of choices, lots of options, even a royalty share program that's available. Or, if you already have the audiobook produced and ready to go, you can leverage Findaway Voices. You can choose one or all or whatever combination of the pathways that you want to distribute to through Findaway Voices. But I strongly advise you're going to want to use Spotify. You're going to want to use Chirp. Spotify, of course, is the company that owns Findaway and Findaway Voices, and it is a gigantic, ginormous, global audiobook platform. Why not be part of this? Why not get people to start checking out your stuff on Spotify by taking advantage of the free Spotify codes that they give you? The other thing I often take advantage of are Chirp deals that you get through BookBub. BookBub owns the company Chirp, and the only way to get your books into Chirp is through Findaway. And in July, I've got several features going on Chirp, as well as some of the other retailers, thanks to the quarterly promotions that Findaway Voices offers to authors. Now, if you're looking for an audiobook solution, Findaway Voices is definitely something you're going to want to check out. And I suggest, if you want to check them out, you can check them out while counting how many times I said check them out here over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. Oh, the crazy summer of Mark is in full swing. And therefore, I'm not going to share personal updates, just to say still working on my Die Hard book. Still going full tilt, doing lots of travel, etc., etc. So, I'm going to forego personal update and comments for this episode and get right into this interview with Peter. Hey, Peter, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, particularly considering the time zones, and I know exactly how late it is for you in Australia. But Speaking of late, I'm a writer who writes really early in the morning. That's when I find myself most productive. I want to talk a little bit about when you're most productive as a writer and publisher now. But is it morning? Is it, midnight? How does that work for you?
It varies a bit. So by nature, I am a night owl. I would happily start work at about 10 o'clock at night, work through till about 2 or 3 in the morning.
Okay.
Um, and that's kind of, that's kind of my comfort zone. But the truth of any writing life is you very rarely get to work with your within your comfort zone. So at various points in my life, I've had part-time and full-time jobs. I have a spouse who works fairly regular hours. So by inclination, I'm a nighttime writer. By necessity, I've become one of those people who can get up at 5 in the morning and get my word count done by the time 7 o'clock breakfast has started.
That's
And
amazing.
That's come in very, very handy as I've kind of split and kind of gone from being just a writer and become a writer and a publisher. So.
Yeah. So I want to dig into that because you've got so many different roles and you've evolved over years, but I want to take it right back early in the evolution. When did this writing thing really take hold in your life?
Very, very early on. I'm one of those people who wanted to be a writer since I was a kid. So
Okay.
Probably around 8 or 9 that, if you'd asked me what I was going to do when I grow up, it was kind of like, I'm going to be a writer.
Right.
And to the despair of my parents, I never actually sort of lost that inclination. So I've kind of been a career writer since then. I've done a lot of stuff around writing. Like even when I go and work, even when I've gone and done contract gigs or actually taken sort of full-time roles, they've always been writing associated. So I've worked for a bunch of the State Writers Centre, National Writers Centre here in Australia. I've worked for local literary festivals, all that sort of stuff. So it's always been this very sort of trying to incorporate the things that I'm doing that are not writing. I always want to make sure they're feeding back into writing and giving me information and a skill set that I can apply to the writing world.
Oh, wow. And was it always speculative writing for you?
No, not at all. I actually went and did an undergraduate writing degree on the Gold Coast where I grew up. For those of your audience who are internationally based and in the US, think of Miami with slightly less charm. That's pretty much the environment in which I learned to be a writer.
And lots of creatures that want to kill you, right? That's their only.
That's pretty much Australia-wide, yeah.
Okay.
But it was it was a really interesting place, but it was also not a particularly speculative friendly kind of degree at the time.
Okay.
No one would have overtly said, please don't write genre, but there was kind of that, the expertise of the people I was learning from was literary fiction and poetry and everything else. So I actually did an undergraduate degree focused on poetry and playwriting. Did a honors thesis in poetics, and for a number of years, like even after I'd started writing speculative fiction and I did a lot of writing for RPG games, poetry is kind of one of those things you can never escape it once you've done it. Like for a decade afterwards, people go, this is Peter, he's a poet.
Well, I'm jumping all over the place here because I'm really excited to talk about things. But you mentioned role-playing games and RPG, and you'd mentioned something previously about to me offline about R20, and I'm curious. So was it the Dungeons and Dragons, and I was going to say real world Dungeons and Dragons with the books and the paper and the pens and the die?
It was. So and that's actually kind of how I got my start with publishing. In the early 2000s, the then third edition of Dungeons and Dragons open sourced their rules, so pretty much anyone could, if they followed a bunch of guidelines, could produce books to support the game. And it was a really fascinating time to be a writer because I'd always been sort of interested, and I was like, I knew I did not want to be doing poetry forever,
right?
So I started freelancing in the role-playing game space and eventually started e-publishing in that space because I don't know if you're familiar with the publishing platform Drive Through Fiction.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
So back in about 2004, 2005, they were actually a much smaller company called RPG Now, which was a really early ebook focused store for the gaming industry.
Okay.
So I started publishing through there in about 2005 and sort of launched my first publishing company. Did about, God, I think about 60 books. It's been, we're talking 20 years ago. I forget an
Well,
awful lot of
in
things.
2005, 60 books, but
Yeah,
and you're doing this independently. This is prior to a
yeah.
lot of self-publishing. So let's go back to the freelancing for a second. Were you writing modules and things like that, or were you writing fiction based on the universes?
Modules and rule sets. So
Okay.
it's a like it's kind of hard to describe it if you're not familiar with it, because it was one of the first things that happened when this kind of ebook boom started.
Right.
Is a lot of people involved in the RPG space suddenly sat down and started to pull apart what an RPG book actually looked like.
Right.
So it had traditionally been like, you buy these things in 64-page hardcovers,
Yeah.
or and that they had a very specific format, and suddenly people going, well, like, really, all you're buying this for is this handful of monsters or this character class. And so these much smaller, much compact products started to come around, and there was just kind of a real hunger for content
Yeah.
in a way that I'd never really seen anywhere until 2009 or so, when the Kindle came along, and that hunger for content sort of emerged in the fiction space. And it was a really interesting thing to watch, because having gone through that entire process with the RPG industry,
Yeah.
when the Kindle launched, I could literally sit there and kind of go, okay, this is what's happened, and then this happened with RPG Now, so this is probably going to, they've launched Kindle Unlimited, and this is probably, it's going to change, because for much the same reason, RPG Now went and sort of like, we've got all these 8-page books, and it's too hard to find the content, and people are starting to move. So they started to change their business model and make all these shifts in the industry, and people watched their business model evaporate overnight, and had to figure out ways to respond to it.
Right.
So it was a really interesting kind of microcosm of what the fiction publishing space became a few years later.
I'm just fascinated, because I was playing Dungeons and Dragons in the early 80s, and we had an hour drive to get into the city where the stores were, and very limited in Canada, where I was in northern Ontario, of what modules you could purchase for Dungeons and Dragons, and they were expensive, and you got a lot of content. I can only imagine being able to turn that around and say, oh, I could just go online and get just the 8 to 10 page thing that I need, probably for a much better price, and get it immediately, right?
It was amazing, because I live in Australia. The ability to find D&D material was even scarcer. It was kind of everything I ordered was through mail order, or by traveling 2 hours by train to the nearest city, to the one shop where I could reliably find it, and praying they hadn't shut down in the 6 months since my last visit. So to suddenly kind of have this wealth of material at my fingertips was just kind of like, this is amazing. Like, but also by that point, I'd been around writing enough that I could sort of see, okay, it's not just all this material. People are actually doing really interesting things with the freedom digital publishing gives them. And when I say digital publishing, these are very crude forms of digital publishing. This was selling people PDFs.
Well, yeah, back in 2005, right? There was no Kindle. The iPad didn't exist. Publishers thought PDFs were ebooks.
And it was like just watching people pull that apart and kind of rebuild what the industry could look like. And to an extent where I don't think it's ever really gotten, even though Dungeons and Dragons moved on, I think they're up to 5th edition and possibly heading into what they're definitely not calling the 6th now. They shut down the open license, so you could no longer do the D20 branded stuff, but there's still a really big community marketplace for you can call it fan generated work, but it's a sort of an officially licensed fan generated work,
Right.
and it's spread through other game systems and become this kind of industry unto itself.
Okay. Wow. So then early, like 2005, et cetera, you're doing all this digital publishing early on,
Yep.
which must have been really liberating for somebody, particularly in Australia, when you're thinking about the London and the New York publishers that just seem like a world away, right?
Oh yeah.
Mailing manuscripts and all that stuff. What was that next step in your evolution? Having done all of these, mini module things and all the RPG stuff.
The next step was largely seeing the problem of the business model.
Okay.
So by about sort of 2006, 2007, I could sort of look at it and kind of go, okay, I am making a fairly decent amount of money from producing these products, but it's all under a license that someone else holds. And at some point, they're going to turn around and say, okay, we don't want you to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And while there were steps that could be taken to sort of mitigate that, like there was a second version of the license. This is very insider pool, I'm very aware. But there was you can use the rules. You can use these rules, but you cannot say that they're D&D rules. But here is this version. Even that's really interesting because in the last year, the current team running Dungeons and Dragons have kind of turned around and go, we would like to take that license away. We would, that's not going to be a thing anymore. And so that's been a whole furor online. But so about 2006, I could see that was the problem. And I was like, okay, I need to pivot. Like I can't continue to write role-playing games anymore, role-playing game material anymore. And I was kind of losing the passion for it. Because as it became more and more of a job, there are, I had come from a university degree where I'd done a lot of cultural studies, and gaming kind of wasn't keeping up with the kind of conversations about feminism and intersectionality that has become the norm in pretty much everywhere these days. So there would be lots of points where I'm just like, I'm really quite frustrated with this culture that I'm engaged with. So it was kind of like, okay, I need to pivot to something. It's probably time to pivot to fiction. I'd never really kind of sat down and said, like, I wanted to be a sci-fi writer, but I'd never sort of sat down and said, I'm really going to try and do it, because if you're in Australia, there are maybe 3 science fiction magazines that I could access and submit to.
Right.
If you've never lived outside of the US where the major magazines are and had to deal with the joy of the, what is it, reply paid coupons, where you had to
we call them international reply coupons or something. Yeah, because we couldn't do an SASE from Canada to the US. I had to go, and it was like $1.10 for a 20-cent stamp. Or something like that, right?
It was insane. And in Australia, I would go to post office and say, I need one of these things, and they'd look at me and just go, we have no idea what these things are. Like, someone would have to go and look up a manual and dig them out from the bottom drawer. It was kind of this thing where it's like, none of this makes sense. But so 2007 happened. Bunch of international science fiction and fantasy magazines started opening to digital submissions, and that was a huge thing. And at the same time, there was a very short-lived version of the Clarion Writers Workshop that launched in Australia. So I went to that and sort of spent 6 weeks around a whole bunch of writers who were just talking science fiction and fantasy all the time, and met with a bunch of professional writers and editors. And that was a real education for me, because one of the interesting things about doing a university degree, and I kind of did my degree, did an honors, went and enrolled in a PhD. There's a business model that they kind of lead you towards as a writer. And it was, do your degree, get your PhD, submit your PhD novel to a major national award, win it, and then go teach in universities for the rest of your life. And that was like, it wasn't a great model of being a writer, but it was the only model that I really felt like I had access to. So Clarion was really transformative, because it was a point where professional writers and editors said, no, here's what you're going to do if you want to get published. You're going to do this and this and this. You're going to submit here and here and here. And it was the first time someone sort of sat me down and sort of said, here's what you need to understand about writing. It's a bulk industry. Like, you don't write your one great short story and send it off, and that's going to make your career. Write 20, send them off, and then write the next 20. And as soon as someone told me that, I was like, oh, that all makes perfect sense. And it was this kind of perfect storm of someone had given me a business model. Technology had changed the industry in a way that I suddenly had access to these markets. And I knew I was losing interest in the RPG stuff that I'd been doing. So I was just like, yep, all in. I'm just going to shut down my RPG publisher, and immediately just went straight to, I'm just going to write fiction. I'm all in. And this is what I'm doing from here on in.
Oh my God. But again, that wasn't enough for you, right? So you had your Peter M. Ball branded fiction and things that you were publishing. I'm just curious, like in those earlier days, right? Because this is still the early aughts or the mid aughts before all of the platforms existed. How were you getting your work out there?
So 2007, I was going a very traditional route. So I was looking at the traditional and the emerging online markets for short fiction in science fiction and fantasy, and I am by inclination a short fiction writer. Part of the reason why I'd never pursued it is because in my head, if I wanted to be a fantasy writer, I was going to have to write trilogies where every book was large enough to concuss a burglar if I really had to, and I was just like, that's not fun for me. So it was very, very traditional, but I was paying attention to what was going on in digital, going on in the indie space, because around that time I actually got a job with the Queensland Writers Centre, and they were hosts to one of their sub-organisations was the Institute for the Future of the Book Australia, which was a spin-off of one of the early think tanks about digital publishing in the US. And so my day job for about 6 years was running workshops on digital publishing, because I largely got the job because I met their CEO at a conference bar and we had a very long conversation about digital publishing. And I basically said, here's what happened in RPGs, and this is what I'm looking at in Kindle, and this is what I think will happen. And not a lot of it was wrong. So it was a job where I spent a lot of time answering questions about publishing. And particularly in that run from about 2008 to about 2012, 2013, a lot of that was about digital publishing, and that shift from how we went from, how to get published was a really easy question to answer. When it was just traditional publishing, it was write your book, submit it, Once you added independent publishing and really accessible independent publishing on top of that, it completely changed things, because you had to answer all of those questions very differently. And really, you could no longer kind of go, okay, this is what you want. There's no easy answer. The first part of the conversation actually became, well, what do you actually want from publishing? Because everyone would go, can you tell me how to get published? And you go, here's how you submit to a publisher. And then they go, okay, so can you tell me about publishing on Amazon? And it'd be like, well, I can, but you need to understand these are very, very different things. If your dream is seeing your book on a bookshelf and getting invited to your local literary festival, then indie publishing is not for you. If your dream is I'm going to live this hedonistic writer lifestyle, indie publishing is not for you. If you have ever daydreamed about running a small business and managing everything yourself, then indie publishing is great. And I do love running my own small business. I love the challenge of publishing and being able to question what books can do. So I was always kind of keeping tabs on it. In the back of my mind, I'm like, eventually there's going to be a point where it's time to go back to indie publishing. And eventually I had published enough short stories and had the rights to them that I'm like, okay, it's time to just start doing something with all of these. I had some novellas that the rights were reverting to me. I had enough content that there was space to run a publishing company off it for about 2 or 3 years without actually having to write anything new, which, one of the things I love about being a writer is, the ability to create new work without actually having to put all that much effort into it. It's great.
Wow.
So I launched Brainjar Press in about 2017, largely as a vehicle for publishing my backlist.
Okay.
I had the idea that it would become a small press eventually.
So by backlist,
Uh,
let's just confirm for people who are not familiar with that industry
sure.
term. Is this content you had already either sold and released and the rights reverted back to you? Is this some stuff that maybe never sold and you still had? What was that?
It was primarily stuff that I'd sold and released, and the rights had come back to me.
Okay.
So between 2017 and about 2012, I did a lot of short fiction.
Okay.
Like I think probably about 50 or 60 stories.
Okay.
I'd sold a couple of novellas. I'd blogged a lot, as many of us did back in that
Yes.
point. And one of the great things, like cutting your teeth in short fiction, is great because short fiction is that space where you learn just how much you can do with a short story.
Right.
And even short stories that feel like you've kind of launched them into the world and they haven't done well,
Yeah.
sort of have their moments. So, my record is, I think, selling one of my short stories about 5 or 6 times. And it's made significantly more in the reprints than it ever did in the original publication.
Yeah.
So when those rights revert, I'm always looking for them and going, okay, so what can I do with this now? It's had the original print publication. Can I do it? Can I send it somewhere that's an audio market? Someone has just launched an anthology that is looking for all these a specific kind of stories. Do I have anything in my backlist? Do they take reprints? So that kind of became ingrained in my mind as part of my mindset. And indie publishing was just the next step of that. Like it was, here is a space where you can put, you can put the books up and they don't necessarily have to sell a lot. Because the economies of scale are so different to traditional publishing, and the distribution is so much wider than you could ever have done prior to ebooks, that there's always a benefit to it. So that was kind of the starting point.
Okay.
The other reason I did it is I knew back in my head I want to do a small press one day. I figured I'd indie publish for about 10 years, make all the mistakes on my books so I'm not screwing up someone else's.
Right.
And then I could do that. Then I would relaunch Brainjar, or launch a small press that took what I'd learned and all the things I'd figured out and apply them to other people's books. And that probably would have been the plan had we not had a global pandemic.
So fascinating, starting off in that traditional publishing model, discovering digital and all the possibilities that were opening up early as a pioneer, and then readapting a new traditional model. Because how does Brain Jar Press work from an author's perspective who says, oh my God, I want a real publisher like Brain Jar Press. How do I work with them? Do I submit to them? Do I mail my manuscript and put a self-addressed stamped envelope and send it to Australia?
It varies a bit depending on where we are. So the version in my head that Brain Jar operates now, which I think of as Brain Jar 2.0, started in 2020. The seeds of it had sort of started in 2019, where by virtue of working in a writer's center, and I'd run 4 iterations of a national genre writing conference, and I'd been a writer for about 15 years by that point, so I had a network, and among my network were a lot of writers who were immensely talented, had really big audiences, but weren't always particularly interested in indie publishing, or weren't always wanting to take on the work of indie publishing their own work. Right. So I would start having conversations with them where they'd kind of go, so like they'd look and kind of go, you've published this book of essays which started as your blog, and this is making income. If I had these kinds of essays and I didn't want to do something, could I submit them to you? And I'm like, yeah, sure. One of our most popular books is actually a poetry collection from a writer named Kathleen Jennings. So Kathleen was better known at the time as an artist. So she'd been nominated for Hugo's, had done covers for a bunch of small presses, was at the time just starting to do illustrations for special editions for authors like Holly Black. And Kathleen and I are friends, so we would hang out and write every week, which is how I found a lot of the early authors. Is we hung out and write, and every now and then someone would go, so Kathleen's like, I've got this series of tweets that I wrote when I was traveling around the US and the UK, where I just watched what was going on outside and
Right.
wrote notes on Twitter. And people keep saying I should do something with them. Can you take a look and tell me how to do it?
Right.
And if you've been indie publishing long enough, you know that you do that thing where it's like, okay, so here's what you do. You take these, and I looked at them, and they were really obviously a poetry collection. Like, you could structure them really elegantly that way.
Yeah.
And I was just like, here's what you do. You get the cover art, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. And, I'm an indie publisher, so everything runs off my laptop. So as I'm doing this, I'm literally like, here's the cover. You grab this image, you do this.
Yeah.
You do something like this, and then you grab vellum, and then you do this, and then you do this. And we kind of got to the end of it, and Kathleen was like, could you just do it? Like, it seems like it would be easier. So we did, and we had the good fortune of launching that about 3 months after she did her first book. Like, she had launched her first book through tour.com. It was part of their novella line, and it went huge. So it was this kind of real blessing of like, Brainjar 2.0 launched with Kathleen's poetry collection and 2 short story collections from a writer named Angela Slatter, who's a World Fantasy Award winner, British Fantasy Award winner. Like, this writer with a huge profile.
Yeah.
And we sort of put these things out in the midst of the pandemic in 2020, right at the point where everyone's kind of locked down and looking for things to do and just looking for something to be excited about. And it went huge. Like, it was a very different experience to anything that I'd done publishing my own work, to the point where I looked at my bank account after the first week and said, okay, I've always been a little bit sort of casual about money and publishing and not really paying attention to what's going on. But this is a very large chunk of money that is, I can get into real trouble because I've committed to doing print editions and I've got to pay the authors. So I suddenly need to have a whole system around this. So that was kind of the start of it. That was just me publishing my friends in the midst of the pandemic because stuff was going on.
Right.
But I immediately had a plan for it. So I looked at the things that we were publishing and then said, okay, what comes next? And for the first year, we did open submissions. There is a very traditional, here are our guidelines, send us these kinds of books. We're very specific about the books we take. So I'm very upfront about, I'm not interested in anything that a traditional publishing house would necessarily look at. Our cutoff for novels is about 60,000 words. We don't want anything over that.
Yeah.
Whereas most of the time, it's like, we don't want anything under that. We do a lot of short fiction. We do a lot of chapbooks. But a lot of what we did for that first year was going out and sourcing books. So one of our first publishing lines was a series called Writer Chaps, which was going around to an incredible crew of Australian science fiction and fantasy writers, many of whom I'd been following for 2 decades online. They'd been the people whose blogs I would go to trying to answer writing questions, or the people whose blogs I would point people towards when I was working at the Writers' Centre and sort of say, you need to see these things. And much as we joke about the idea that the internet is forever, the internet's quite transitory. So I'd noticed that a bunch of the essays that I would point people towards, stuff that was like, this is amazing and really transformative for me as a writer, disappeared as people rebuilt their websites or stopped doing blogs. So I basically just created a list of all these people and emailed them and said, hey, we've got this idea for a series of books that are just short chapbooks. It'll be 5 or 6 essays per writer. It's all stuff you've written already. You don't need to do anything. We can't pay you up front, but I'll give you a percentage of sales, and we're running it as a series, and it will be this entire thing that will sustain and actually make you a little bit of money during the pandemic, where you have to do, it's very little effort on your part. And that was a real strategic project. Like, the whole point of that was getting to do an incredible bunch of books that are really, really lovely and a pleasure to hold, and all the things that I love about doing print books. Like, I like the physical object, but it was also a series that over the course of 6 books just let us bring aboard authors that you would not expect for a press of our size.
Right.
We got to publish Angela Slatter's nonfiction. We got the second book was by a fantastic a fantastic Australian author, Tasmanian author named Tansy Rayner Roberts, who was just sort of picking up speed at that point. The third book was by Sean Williams, who's kind of, if you're not familiar with Sean Williams' work, he many years ago, he's kind of like the elder statesman of science fiction in Australia. He will probably hate me saying that. And one of the first people to launch at the top of the New York Times list with a game adaptation novel. Like, Sean does incredible work. We got to publish Kim Wilkins as part of that line. So Kim's, again, a veteran Australian science fiction and fantasy writer who's something like 40 books into her career.
Yeah.
And so that was enough. Like, that was a series that got us attention. And as those writers worked to us and realized, hey, we will do things with these strange little projects that traditional publishing has not been great at managing, they would start coming to us, or they'd recommend people to us. And so for about 2 years, we basically built on that. I was really, really, really careful. I was like, we don't want to be launching a new writer because we don't have the profile for that. We're not set up to do it.
Yeah.
We need to build the profile of the press. We need to borrow sort of the cultural capital of all the people that we're publishing, and gradually sort of get well known enough that when we launch a new writer, we have some momentum behind us that we can convey to the writer and then move from there.
Cool. Now you talked and you mentioned this just a bit earlier, your passion for print, and you talked about previous to this interview, print forward or print first, focusing on print, which doesn't seem very indie digitally minded, especially considering geolocations, because print is about shipping dead trees around, right?
It is
warehousing and shipping dead trees, but it's not in your case, right?
It is. Australia is a horrible country to ship dead trees around as well, because we are a very, very large country with a very, very empty center. There's all our population is on the fringes, and every now and then I see international authors being like, okay, so like I feel really strange, like I have to charge $20 for my book in Australia. Is that right? It seems too much. I'm like, no, that's just how much it is, because the economies of scale.
That's a good price, $20.
That's a great price in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, like in Canada, you can't get a paperback for $20 anymore. Trade paperback, not mass market, still $15 or $12.
But it's just kind of the space. We don't have the population for it. We're too big. It costs a lot of money to ship dead trees around.
Yeah.
But that being said, I love dead tree books. Like, I love print books. And I fell in love with print accidentally as a publisher.
Okay.
So when I was doing when Brain Jar was just me, I was never like, okay, I'm going to learn to do print. I was just kind of like, why am I doing print? Print is dead.
Yeah.
There's no reason to do print. Everyone's just going to buy the ebooks.
Yeah.
But one of the things I know about me is I will happily sort of squander opportunities if it's just me. But if it's someone that I know and respect, it's like, I do not want to screw this up for you. So when Brain Jar 2.0 launched, I was like, okay, I actually need to set up my direct sales portal. Like, I actually need to have an online store.
Okay.
Just because this is the expectation. Like, if we're a small press and we're legitimately selling other people's books and trying to do it in a way that actually makes everyone money, let's do the online store. And I didn't expect it to be a big deal. Like, I largely set it up almost as an afterthought, because I was running a Patreon, and a bunch of patrons sort of said, here is a bunch of cash, like, go do something with it. And I was like, okay, I'll set up the store. And I was like, okay, we've launched, these books are available here. Oh, and they're available at our store. And then I saw the sales through the store, and I did I worked out the profit on each of those books, and I was just kind of like, okay, I have been converted.
So are you printing these locally? Are they digital printing? Are they offset? Like, how are they? Are you storing them somewhere, or are they just being produced as they sell?
It's a combination of it. So I use Ingram Spark. I love Ingram Spark because it overcomes one of the biggest problems of print, which is, if I'm printing in Australia and managing all the stock myself, then it's really expensive to get a book to America or Canada or Europe. Like we're in our office, we actually joke that Australia is it's cheaper to get things to Narnia than it is to Australia, or from Australia.
Way easier too.
Using print on demand is amazing for that because it gives us the best of both worlds. We can have a huge amount of reach as a small press, and we sell the bulk of our print on demand into the US.
So do you just drop ship right from the back end of Ingram to the customer who buys directly from your website? Okay.
Or through Ingram's distribution services.
Yeah,
we price in a way that makes it an attractive proposition.
Yeah,
but within that, we will order 50 to 100 copies of a book to have around our offices because that's roughly what we know we can sell. We can, and we do it via pre-orders. Like we actually look at our pre-orders and go, okay, we've had this many pre-orders. We will order 3 times that many books because pre-orders will be maybe a third of the overall sales. But
you're probably shipping domestically because it's expensive enough domestically. You're not shipping off the continent, right?
We do on occasion. There are a couple of places.
Okay, I thought that would be cost prohibitive though.
It is. It's a very specific choice, so we don't do it everywhere. But there's just a couple of places where it's like, you know what? Most of Europe, it's easier to ship from here than to drop ship.
Oh, okay. Because I thought there would be printers in Europe that would get it faster and cheaper too.
Probably, but like it's a cost to benefit ratio. If we were getting a lot more orders from Europe, we'd do it. We don't do a lot. We don't mail out review copies we don't drop ship review copies. So a lot of those we will send from Australia to,
and they come from your press, right? With your imprint and logo on the envelope with the cover letters and stuff.
It's we want the branding to be there, and we want it to look like every other book that shows up.
Yeah.
But just even that sort of 50 to 100 copies that we sell locally is really the meat of our production budget.
Right.
Like it is, when you're looking at print book prices, there's a thought exercise I often do, which is how many books do I need to sell to make it to $100?
Okay.
And often when I do the math, it works out as like, okay, I need to sell 50 copies of this book via an ebook at $2.99 in order to make it there. But I would only need to sell a fraction of that, often as low as sort of 15 to 20 books in order to make $100 from the direct sales.
Right.
So that became that was an eye-opener. That was, okay, well, why aren't we leading with direct sales? Like, why aren't we trying to put as much focus as possible on selling the books from our store? Because that 55% that you normally give, that normally goes to a distributor and the bookstore, gives you a lot of leeway to make a profit on a book, even with print-on-demand prices.
But that's assuming you're not doing the bargain basement drive to the bottom that a lot of indie authors think about. And they try it for print too, right?
They do. It drives me a little bit nuts. I totally understand it. It drives me a little bit nuts because I have made all these mistakes. The difference is I made these mistakes in 2005.
Right.
My advice when I used to teach classes on indie publishing was when you're trying to figure out the price of your ebook, figure out the absolute maximum where you almost feel embarrassed about asking this much for your ebook, then add $2, because you are underpricing your book.
I love that.
And print is the same. The challenge I think indies have with print is our mindset and our business models being developed by the ebook marketplace, and particularly the parts of the ebook marketplace that has a vested interest in driving down the costs of books and making sure that the cost of an ebook is within a very narrow range.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work with print. The thing with print is you're never going to compete with mass market paperbacks on price if you're using print on demand. But you also don't need to. The traditional publishing industry has always had small presses. And those small presses have survived and even thrived by producing more expensive books and understanding that the people that they're marketing towards is not the mass market. It's a very small, very dedicated reader base that is absolutely willing to show up and support that small press because it's part of their overall sense of identity. Like I am a science fiction and fantasy writer. I'm also a science fiction and fantasy reader. I'm a huge fan of certain authors, and I will it is one of those things where it's like, day one, I'm there to buy their books. When their books come out from small presses, like, it is a moment of joy because it's like, oh, I have access to this thing that traditional publishing wouldn't put out.
Yeah.
And suddenly, suddenly that this can be sent to me, and it will be fantastic. And it is a thing that I can hold up and sort of say, look, I am a fan of this writer. And that's like, there's almost a totemic aspect to it. And I think that's what gets a bit lost when we start thinking about print as indies, is we're so used to being like, okay, everything is, the indie publishing business model is basically like, we're going to replicate what mid-list publishing used to be. And I get a bit frustrated about that as well, because I'm like, you've been given a easy access to the largest book distribution in the world, and we just want to recreate what has always been done by mid-list publishing. So, I'm a big fan of like, let's just break the idea of a book. Like, what is the smallest possible book you can do? How can we play around with these things and see what happens? Because the market and the readership will often sort of sustain a lot more than we assume they will as writers.
Yeah.
Particularly when we're kind of caught in that space where it's like, I've wanted to be a writer since I was 8 years old. And within that space, I have heard there is no money in writing far more than any other piece of business advice in the writing world. And even if you're the most you're incredibly conscious of it and really mindful of it, it's really hard to escape that feeling of like, I've published this book, I'm really sorry, would you like to buy it? And the greatest gift of publishing other people is that disappears. It's like, I have published this person and they are awesome.
Yeah.
I am going to make sure that I get this book into as many hands as possible in order to make it worthwhile for me, worthwhile for them, and worthwhile for every reader who picks it up and reads it. And that's the learning curve of that's been phenomenal, because it's like everything that I've done on the Brainjar 2.0 space, I could eventually bring back to my own work and kind of go, let's see what we can do with this.
Oh, I love that. So as we're getting close to the end, I have two final questions. The first one is, Peter, considering how much work you're doing to prop up and support other authors and books you could really believe in and love to support and market, you still have time for your own writing? Are you still making time to get your own stuff out there too?
I do. It varies a bit. Quite honestly, between 2020 and 2022, I didn't do a lot of my own writing. Setting up Brainjar, and it was quite a conscious decision. I'm setting up Brainjar Press.
Right.
This is the thing. I actually got a small business development grant to work on it for a year, where they basically paid a nominal amount towards my living expenses, and just said, go and figure out how to make this into a professional thing. And that was phenomenal. That was an experience that is very, very hard to replicate, but it was a gift. Yeah. Not long after that, I did actually go back to full-time work and worked for the Brisbane Writers Festival here in Queensland. And that's when it started to really wear on me, because it was like, I'm doing all this work for writers in my day job. And it is a huge undertaking. If you've never run a major statewide writer festival, particularly in the midst of a pandemic, and Brisbane flooded halfway through that as well, it was an experience. It was a huge amount of work. Like, it was 16-hour days, and just like, there was never a point where I was not thinking about it.
Right.
I started to kind of go, okay, I'm actually really missing writing. It's starting to almost hurt that I'm not doing this. So I started a project. I was still running my Patreon at the time. And I was like, okay, here is what I have to write. The time I have available to write is the 8 minutes between when I leave my house on a train and when I arrive at my office. Maybe a little bit more in my lunch breaks if a meeting does not run long. What can I do? And so I started a project where in that 8 minutes, I would take a 3x5 index card and write a paragraph of a flash fiction. And over the course of a couple of months, did enough of these. And it's like, okay, I actually have this backlog of stories. And so I was like, okay, so what I'm going to do with my Patreon now is I'm going to publish a story a week. I I eventually left the Writers Center job, the Writers Festival job, moved on to another job, which is also now wrapped up. So I have a lot more time to write, but it basically just became part of my writing practice now is like, I'm not chasing magazine publication, but I want to write for a very small audience. So I write for my patron. I did that for 48 straight weeks of posting a short story a week on top of everything else I was doing.
Right.
And once I kind of did that, I'm like, okay, well, now that I've done that, I'm me. I have all these short stories that I have the rights to. I need to do something with. So I launched my own short story magazine, which is every month I just publish a new 80-page magazine that's full of short fiction and nonfiction that I've produced over that period. So that's kind of enough to kind of keep my hand in. I'd still feel like a writer on top of everything else.
Wow.
It is slowly picking up a bit now that I'm back in a more freelance space and have a lot more time to write around the publishing stuff.
Right.
But it's it is there.
Wow. Amazing. So the sort of, I'm really curious because I've learned a lot from you. I'm fascinated, love your perspective. What are you most optimistic about or looking forward to related to what's going on in publishing and digital publishing right now?
I'm honestly really happy to see how many people have started to pick up direct sales. Just because it is such a transformative thing. It's for me, it's possibly the thing that makes indie publishing indie. It's like I like the control of direct sales. I like the idea that I can make the same amount of money of selling 100 copies of this book to people directly one-on-one as I would selling 300 copies somewhere else.
Right.
And I'm excited about that for a lot of reasons. One, it's incredibly important for writers. That it changes your income streams. It gives you a lot more control. It gives you a whole bunch of things to play around with. But the second is I'm actually really excited about what it does to the writing. Like I think one of the things that starting out as a poet teaches you is just how much the poetics of what we do, the craft of what we do, is influenced by the marketplace you exist in. If you look at the history of poetry and all the things that people think of as poetics, the use of rhyme and the use of meter, all of that, like you look at it and kind of go, why does poetry do that? And for years I was like, I don't really understand. But when I studied poetics, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. These are tools to help you remember 300-page epic poems in an oral tradition so that you can go and perform them night after night after night and you're not going to get lost. And then as people develop the printing press and poetry evolves in concert with it. Fiction, I think, works the same way. Like one of the reasons I actually went and did a PhD is because I looked at what's going on in publishing and going, why has series fiction become such a thing? And it's because the marketplace changed to make series fiction attractive as a financial prospect. Like if you're in a traditional publishing paradigm and you can only do you can only publish one book a year and it's got a 2-week to 2-month shelf life, and then it's going to disappear off shelves. And if you're a science fiction and fantasy fan, you've got that experience of like, oh god, I missed that when it came out, so the next 5 years of my life are searching secondhand stores to find that missing third book. That doesn't make fiction, like series, an attractive proposition.
Right.
But you factor in digital, like you factor in ebooks, you factor in digital publishing, you say your backlist is available forever. That changes publishing in really interesting ways. And direct sales, I think, is the same sort of thing. Like direct sales means that the ambition of your work can change. You no longer have to just kind of, you can do really interesting, really weird books with direct sales. And, this has been the domain of small press for decades, but you can do really weird books and really experiment a little and not feel like you're trading it off. Like I'm doing this weird, interesting thing that's completely going to alienate my readers. I'll not make money from it. So, like you can do it and it can attract its audience and it can find people. And that's incredibly interesting to me. I'm really looking forward to seeing the books that emerge out of that.
Awesome. Peter, please, thank you so much for this conversation. Please let my listeners know where they can find out more about you and Brain Jar Press online.
Well, thanks for having me. You can find Brain Jar Press online at brainjarpress.com, and on most social media sites, we are just Brainjar Press. And you can find out more about me at petermbull.com. And again, pretty much any social media that's out there, I'm there under that name.
Awesome. I can't believe how much time has passed. I'm so sorry I kept you so long, but I hope you would come back and chat with me again because I had such a great time. Peter, thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. Thanks so much.
There's so much to unpack, so much to reflect on from the interview that I just re-listened to. And this, January, February, we probably did this in April, this interview, I'm guessing. So it's been in the backlog for a while as I have so many interviews I have to get through. But it was so great, actually, I guess that there was so much time because I relearned things. And it was great to listen to this again and to reflect again. So one of the things was, I kind of, I felt like Peter and I are kindred spirits in that he's always worked in a realm associated with writing. So have I, since graduating from university. And then the other thing that I just want to kind of point out is remind you. So the job he got working at the Brisbane Writer Festival was, oh no, that wasn't the Brisbane Writer Festival. This was the job that he got when he was doing online material for helping authors get published. But this happened because the job happened because he met a company CEO at a bar at a conference. And it's those personal connections that I'm always harping on that are really important. They're so important in publishing. They're important in traditional publishing. They're important in the business world. They're also important in indie publishing because you never know how that connection is going to be beneficial for you. Or in some cases, it may be somebody that you meet and then you meet someone else who's looking for someone like the person you met, and you can be the linchpin. You can be the person that connects two people. So many great things can happen from that networking. So just wanted to kind of spotlight that as well. And then just kind of, applaud Peter for being there early and constantly being willing to experiment and look at how you can take publishing. I love how he expressed that with this new tool, with these new free digital tools that we have access to, why would you just do the same thing that mid-list publishing has always done? Why not try something different? Why not experiment? Why not play around? Why not create something new and unique? Why not make it your own? And I love that he's constantly playing with that experimentation and the formats, talking about, the little chapbooks and the different versions. Even the strategy that he's using, saying, hey, there's some material you guys have that's, people would like access to. It's not going to cost you anything. I'll take care of it. I'll put everything together. And then there's this great royalty share where they can earn money off that. And he also is taking content from people who have great content but don't know what to do with it, making it available. Very strategically building that up as he's building the brand for Brainjar Press. But also, again, focusing very much on those niche markets, those niche communities, saying, I know exactly what these people are looking for, and I'm going to give it to them. I'm not going to give them some mass market edition of something. I'm going to give them something that I know they're going to value. And that's just a reminder for all of us. When we think about the products that we're creating, yeah, of course, the dream is we're all going to be like Stephen King and everyone's going to know our names and we're going to sell billions of copies. But that can happen. But it's more likely to happen that you're going to find those people who are just really, really into it, really passionate about those specific things that you're creating. And I love that that's what Peter's doing. And he's reminding us that that's something we can do in our own indie author journey. How about you? What reflections did you have after listening to that interview? I'd love to hear your comments, your reflections. And I don't know if you should even at me at Twitter, because I might have to pay Mr. Musk some money in order for me to see the Twitter feed. And I'm not playing that game anymore. So as they said in the old Monty Python skit, the bird was alive when you bought it. So anyways, I would just say, email me, mark@markleslie.ca. You can tag me in some other social media if you want to dare spell out at Mark Leslie Lefebvre. You can also leave comments and reflections over at starkreflections.ca for any episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the interview. I hope you enjoyed the reflections. Again, please do share your reflections. And if you like the podcast, please feel free to share it with someone that you think would find value in it. So, as I said, this is the end of episode 313. I am Mark Leslie Lefebvre, and next week, I'll probably be here with you for episode 314. And so until next week, and next episode, I'd love to wish you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.